Supreme Being, the Adorable One, the Light of all lights, who manifests and sustains this universe. The Supreme Ruler of all rulers, the Supreme Master of all masters, the Supreme Deity of all deities. May that Supreme Being manifest unto us. May we worship him with loving devotion. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Good evening and good morning to at least one of you. All right. Swami Vivekananda saw this coming. One world. We are one world now in so many ways. Physically, electronically, commercially, environmentally. It had never occurred to me in all these years that from this small chapel in St. Louis, I would be speaking to all of you, mainly in Pittsburgh, but not necessarily in Pittsburgh, Indianapolis. There's at least one person from St. Louis here, but not in the chapel. But Vivekananda, in the 19th century, saw this coming, one world. And he knew how vitally important it is to bring the oneness of Advaita, non-dualism, into that one world that we live in, for so many reasons. Advaita is the source of ethics, the springboard to all unselfish service, and the basis of all unselfishness. So much needed in this shrinking world where we're not doing a very good job of getting along with each other. But that's not today's topic. Today's topic is self-denial and self-manifestation. Now there's an apparent contradiction in this title. How can we have self-development, self-manifestation, when the self is denied, restrained, ignored, or rejected? Self-denial and self-manifestation actually refer to two selves. Self-denial refers to the apparent self, and self-manifestation to the higher self. Now, are there two selves or one self? Now that I've brought this up, are there two selves? There is just one self with many, many disguises. We were talking earlier, we're all masked players. We're all disguised. We all are disguising our higher self with all these roles we play. The one sun that illumines the solar system appears different to us at different times. As an analogy, at sunrise and sunset, the sun appears larger, it's a different color, and it's not as intense. During the day, the sun appears as brighter or darker, depend on the cloud cover. But it's the same sun. According to cloud cover and atmospheric conditions, it appears differently. Last month, and you probably had this too, the residue of an enormous Saharan desert sandstorm passed over St. Louis in the upper atmosphere. And for a couple of days, we just had exquisitely beautiful sunsets, the kind that you just don't see. But it's the same sun appearing differently. 93 million miles away, appearing differently according to the terrestrial conditions. But the disguise of the apparent self with respect to the higher self is a different kind of disguise. Normally, when a person puts on a mask or takes a part in a play, or goes trick-or-treating with that mask, or takes the role of a spy. He or she knows who they are, and they try to fool others. The apparent self is a different kind of disguise, in that we deceive ourselves first, and then others. The whole problem is that we don't know the higher self. And the primary disguise of the apparent self is this body-mind complex that we put on at conception and wear until death. Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita calls it a garment that we put on and wear and then cast aside at death. On the day Swami Vivekananda died in Calcutta, he appeared to Swami Ramakrishna, who was in South India, in a dream, saying, "Sashi, I cast off the body." Actually, it was more graphic than that. He said, "Sashi, I spat out the body," as if it was something completely different from him and unrelated. Sashi, I spat out the body. For world teachers like Sri Krishna and Swami Vivekananda, it's as plain as day. When they say I, if they say I, they are not referring to the body. What it is that they are referring to is not so clear to the rest of us. Now, for most of us, it's plain as day that we are the ever-changing body-mind complex. How do we deceive ourselves with our primary disguise? We are actually not the body, or the mind, or their aggregate. We are actually the knower of the body, the knower of the mind, and the knower of the external world, and distinct from everything that is known. The unchanging observer, the knower, is changeless. All change signifies a frame of reference that is at rest. Change is measured against something that is not changing. That unchanging observer is the real person. It stands behind the ever-changing ego, giving it its continuity. But we don't experience the unchanging observer, the knower, as it is. The knower is always mixed up with the process of knowing. The knower, the process of knowledge, and the object of knowledge are experienced as a dynamic process. We can infer the existence of the conscious observer from relative experience. What maintains our identity through all the changes of the body and mind from birth to death, birth, growth, decay, and death? Why do we feel to be the same entity in spite of all those changes? What connects the dots of all those changes? What connects the experiences of life into a necklace that we can follow from cradle to grave? It's that unchanging conscious observer. We can infer it, but we don't experience it. The ordinary person, and by ordinary person I mean those of us who are not illumined, doesn't separate the knower from the process of knowledge. And for the regular person, the objects of knowledge are much more real than the knower. And since the body and mind are with us in the waking state from cradle to grave, this complex of body and mind becomes the most real thing because it's a constant object of knowledge in the waking state. And it becomes our primary disguise. So, to recap, It is the apparent self, referred to in self-denial, that must be restrained and controlled. And the higher self, the Atman, the conscious, uncreated, knowing, conscious principle, the knower, that is to be manifested. Now, this unchanging observer is linked to the mind and body through a mode of mind called egoism, and through egoism finds expression in the body and mind. The I of egoism identified with the body and its conditions, and through the changes of birth, growth, and decay and death, thinks, I am young or old, tall or short, handsome or ugly, healthy or ill, strong or weak. These are identifications with the body. The I of egoism becomes identified with the mind and its conditions. I'm happy or unhappy, angry or calm, I know or I don't know. And the ego, being identified with the changes of the psychophysical complex, is flitting around in an unbelievably fast way in most of the time. Catching hold of the ego is like trying to catch hold of a shooting star, because it's constantly in flux on the macro level and on the micro level. And the closer we look, the more things are changing. The smaller things get, the faster they move. And we've got so many of these little small things we're looking at. And this ego wears us out, being identified with all these. I mean, what we want is the infinite, the undivided, and the unchanging. And what we get are all these finite changing things. And it wears us out trying to keep up with it. And the only rest that we ordinarily get from the yoke of the ego that pulls us on through our daily lives is in deep, dreamless sleep, when we throw off the yoke of the ego and rest in our own nature, though unconsciously. In the viewpoint of non-dualistic Vedanta, this is the only real rest that we get as human beings, other than deep meditation. But we get that rest in deep sleep. We go back to our own abode in a state of ignorance, and we come out in a state of ignorance. We get good sleep when we go into that deep sleep, and that's very important, but it doesn't illumine us. Going into what is normally deep sleep, consciously we become illumined through the concentration that comes through deep meditation. We eventually enter into that. But we need that every day. It's the first state of sleep that rebounds after sleep deprivation. It's not dream sleep, but deep sleep. Now the mind is intermediary between our body and that unchanging observer. When the mind turns upward towards the unchanging observer, the real self with a capital S, we get more knowledge and joy and more and deeper understanding. And when the mind turns to the body, we get more selfishness. Selfishness and sense attachment get hold of us. And it is by restraining these desires that we make progress as human beings, both secular and spiritual. Now, this is the image in the Upanishads, in this Svetasvatara and the Mundaka Upanishad, of the two birds in the tree. When we look downward at the sweet and bitter fruits of life and taste them, we get pleasure and pain. And when we get an excessively bitter fruit, we look up. We detach, we become aware of the higher self, just for a moment, and we move up a little bit on the tree. It's such a deep analogy. And to put it in psychological terms, we're saying the mind is intermediary between the body and the Atman and the conscious principle. And it just depends upon where the mind looks as to where we're going and how fast we're getting there. Whether we're looking up, whether we're looking down, what that interplay is. So it's by restraining these desires that we're afflicted with because of our identification with our primary disguise, the body-mind complex, that we make progress as human beings, both secular and spiritual. By way of example, we can't even have physical health without self-restraint. As the French say, we dig our graves with our teeth. The grave diggers come later, the cremation team. In the short term, if we overeat, we may be uncomfortable, or we can get sick. It can affect our digestive tract and our ability to assimilate that meal. Too much of a good thing. It only tastes good until we swallow it, you know, so we have to keep swallowing it. If that's our primary mode of enjoyment, I think that gets us into trouble. There are long-term consequences as well if we can't restrain ourselves. There are long-term consequences to health if we don't practice restraint with respect to food, etc. Now, by way of example, maybe 5 years ago, a devotee of ours in northern Louisiana passed away and is at 86. And he might have been the only devotee in northern Louisiana. And Harold was an exceptional person, and Swami Chaitanya couldn't go down there. And his girls, particularly, wanted one of us to go down there and do the funeral service and try to explain to his 5 children and their spouses and their children and their grandchildren why Harold chose this path. And I stayed with them for a couple of days. It's a wonderful family. Harold used to educate them himself. Now, he was raised a Southern Baptist, and his mother lived to 102. He was an only child, and he had to put up with, she said, Harold, everything about you is so good, she said, except this religion you've got yourself mixed up with. And it just worries me to death, she says, because, son, you're going to go to hell when you die. And every time she saw him practically, he had to deal with this. Well, for his own children, they'd go off to Sunday school, to the Southern Baptist. I'm not denigrating, it just happened to be the religion that was surrounding him. And they'd get home on Sunday and he'd say, well, what'd you learn today in Sunday school? And they'd tell him, and then he'd say, well, that's not quite the way it is. And he'd sit them down and he'd give them another lesson. So they grew up with Vedanta. They respected Vedanta. And Lauren, the oldest one, was the first one to come up here and see what was going on. And she told me one day in the kitchen, she said, and this was probably 1979 or 80, she said, people love Daddy, but they don't understand him. And so that was our job, to go down there and explain their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather to him. So I was eating with Lauren and her sister and their families, and they were my hosts. And I noticed that it was a wonderful experience to eat meals with them. They made cornbread for every meal, fresh, like I'd never tasted in my life. Cast iron skillet in the stove, plop it over right out of the oven, put it on the table, slather it with butter. And everything else was kind of the same way. And obviously a little different from my normal menu, but I enjoyed it. I didn't say anything. Finally, Lauren brought it up. She said, well, she said, you probably noticed that we eat the same way that our grandparents did, she said. And Jan and I, my sister and I, are both registered nurses, and we understand that eating like this statistically is going to take about 5 years off our lives, but we'll die happy. Harold was like that. He had a way of just expressing things. So she's expressing, she said, we're going to enjoy our food. We're not going to spend our lives tasting stuff that doesn't taste good just because we live a little long. We're going to enjoy our food, and we're going to eat like our grandparents did, and we accept the consequences. So the question is, where do we get our joy? And she stated it very clearly that this is something that they decided they aren't going to sacrifice. So a little digression, what is happiness? Another example. We have one of those devotees that I didn't talk about on Friday. Wanda Ellis also came in the mid-50s. And she and her husband were just pillars in this center. And Wanda, you could regulate your watch according to her entrance and arrival here to give service. Cooked 2 days a week, took care of the library. She and her husband refinished every chair in our chapel and library at our 50th Golden Jubilee, stripped them down to bare wood and refinished them. Made the drapes. I mean, this woman's a dynamo. But she never took and never has taken the position of knowing anything, of being a teacher, of giving advice. But her life is an inspiration. So one day I caught her off guard. She was Xeroxing something for the library up in the office. And I was doing something else. And as she was passing through, I said, Wanda, I said, what's the secret of happiness? She paused for a moment, and she said, the secret of happiness is to have a goal in life. And the higher the goal, the better. And the highest goal is God realization. End of conversation. She continued on to her next task. That's Wanda. Now, if we want to succeed, if we want to become happy people, the goal can be secular or spiritual. Having a goal integrates the ego and puts relative priority on the various facets of life. For instance, if a person wants to be a professional athlete, there are so many aspects related to health that must be regulated, starting with the type, quality, and regularity of the food intake. And there's a mental aspect of athletic training as well. At the higher levels, it must be taken into account. If our goal is spiritual, we need a healthy body to sustain our spiritual disciplines. The health of the body and mind is a means to the ultimate goal of realizing God. We don't want to be like the little pond that Ramakrishna talks about. When an elephant takes a bath in that little farm pond, it just wrecks it, you see. Spiritual experiences, even not to speak of the highest spiritual experiences, take a toll on the body and mind, and we need a strong body and mind. Practice those disciplines and to enlarge the body of water that we have to receive the grace of God so that we can handle it when it does come. Food has to be evaluated not just for nutrition and quantity, but also for its effect on the mind. Certain foods agitate the mind, others calm it. And if we regulate our lives in such a way that we can determine the effect of different foods, we can regulate our food intake by reverse engineering it from our ultimate goal. In any case, keeping our bodies healthy requires self-restraint, self-control, and is necessary in order to meet our higher goal, whether that goal is secular or spiritual. Essentially, we're pure, free, and perfect, but that real existence is mixed up with the psychophysical constitution, which is not pure and perfect. We're not born pure and free, as the French Enlightenment philosophers Rousseau and Voltaire put forward. We're not a blank slate. There's plenty there when we're born. And we're not all equal. The real person, the Atman, is pure and free, the higher self. And the Atman is the same in each and all. But the body-mind complex is a different category. There are many factors that are not very desirable hidden in the subsoil of the mind. In Christianity, in Christian theology, it's called sin. In Hindu metaphysics, it's past samskaras. It's our own past history, the residue of our own past actions, buried in our mind, influencing us for the most part subconsciously. So this body and mind needs to be regulated in order to manifest the higher self. It needs to be controlled even for physical development and health. And intellectually, morally, spiritually, all that needs self-restraint. And religion prescribes certain courses and vows by which the willpower can be increased and grow. We need that, really, if we're going to take a hold of all those aspects of the mind that need to be purified and become free. The willpower grows by controlling our desires and by observing these different vows and by following moral principles, which are not easy to follow. Life presents many temptations. There can't be any real progress in life, no matter what our goal is, unless human beings have the capacity to restrain and sublimate the basic biological urges and needs that we share with the lower animals. The basic energy becomes transformed through restraint and sublimation into physical, intellectual, aesthetic, moral, and spiritual pursuits that distinguish human beings and separate us from the lower animals. By practice of self-control, we can become established in the moral path, which is the basis for all these others. That's dharma. From the moral level, we can reach the transcendental level. And until we reach the transcendental level, we aren't safe. It's a staircase and we can rest on the landing, but we aren't safe until we reach that ultimate reality. There are always booby traps until the mind is bathed in that transcendent light, and some scars are burnt up. This is what Sri Ramakrishna refers to in his little example. He says the expert dancer never takes a step, never takes a wrong step, never takes a step that's out of rhythm. And what is that dance? It's the dance of dharma. He never takes a step that's out of dharma because the expert dancer, he or she, that person who has realized God, has reached the source of dharma. The source of dharma is the all-pervading spiritual existence. That's the touchstone. And at that point, they don't need to be regulated by the scriptures because they've reached the source of the scriptures. And their lives become examples that people can use to determine the moral path in their own lives for thousands of years. Ramakrishna, Christ, Buddha, Ramakrishna are all like this. Look at their lives. They become scriptures. They become blueprints for our own development as human beings. And it's a very tricky moral path that we need to follow in order to ground our lives. Now let's see how We can rise through a gradual course of training. We have to rise from where we are. Vivekananda says, take a person from where they stand. And Vedanta doesn't leave anyone else. The great ones save many rotten people that seem rotten from an outside standpoint. So if a person is used to wrong actions, say, like hurting others, if they're vindictive, one of these people with a chip on their shoulder and they're looking for an excuse to knock someone's teeth down their throat or something. There are people like this. If they're habitually vindictive, then you can't start from that point with higher teachings. If they want to improve, they need to start by stopping themselves from injuring others. If they're used to being vindictive, then they've got to throttle it back to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's progress. He may not be able to do positive good to others, but let him at least go in the direction of not hurting others. And this is necessary for our own good. We can't have peace of mind if we achieve our goal in an unfair way. By hurting others, we can't really have joy within. Now, before I joined, I had a job with juvenile delinquent and emotionally disturbed teenagers, and I was trying to understand the teachings of Vedanta at the same time. And I knew that we can't have joy within if we're constantly hurting others. And I thought, well, is this really true? The strongest and meanest kid in that it was a group home setting. They lived there and were educated there and so forth, had vocational training. Didn't appear to have any remorse about all the nasty things that he would do. And he was very vindictive. And I just kind of sat on this and observed, and I found that actually about once a week in the middle of the night, he'd wake up the executive director of the organization because he was having nightmares that were just scaring him. He couldn't handle it. And this same teenager, I was down there for some other reason, not working with them, one evening, and he said, I found this record, I borrowed it. He says, I'm just listening to it. He says, it's really good. And it was a John Lennon album after he separated from the Beatles. And it's called A Working Class Hero. And David started singing that song. He had a beautiful voice. As soon as you're born, they make you feel small till you're so crazy you feel nothing at all. And it went on like that. And he got about halfway through this song and started sobbing because it was his life that it was being described. And, you know, there's always an entry point. There's always an entry point with everybody. So we can't really judge, as I said, the great ones save many seemingly rotten people and became exemplary in the ways that people around them who seemed much better could not do. So by gradually following this course, a person will be able to help others. He won't hurt others, and with that as a foundation, he can gradually develop to do good to others. But he still won't be able to make much self-sacrifice. So this is the middle region. You go to vindictiveness, to a position where you can start to help others, but not really in an unselfish way. The middle stage is trying to help others without sacrificing our own interest, or for the sake of one's own interest, one will do good to others. It's called enlightened self-interest. This is a more refined form of self-interest and not unselfishness in the true sense. Enlightened self-interest is really enlightened selfishness. It's selfishness that's been enlightened by a little bit more of experience. It's political. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You hurt me, I'll hurt you. It's trading. You go along to get along. Now there's a higher aspect that gradually develops. People are being unselfish for somewhat selfish reasons, but gradually through this process, the lower self, the apparent self, the self in disguise expands through self-sacrificing. By sacrificing one's own interests for the sake of others, one develops a longing and feels himself that he's no longer, for that moment, no longer cooped up or confined within a particular individuality and personality. He tastes the joy of self-expansion, and that joy is greater than what he was, and that kind of draws us on to real self-sacrifice. Gradually, a person develops the insight to know that virtue is a value in itself, that is, dharma is a value in itself. How? Because this selflessness, this unselfishness expands us. With this expansion, we have more strength, more knowledge, more freedom. This insight comes gradually through experience. It can't, and through example. You can see it in other people, but mainly it comes through our own experience. Through this process, we become rich in internal resources. And those internal resources become a rock that help us maintain our balance in spite of all external adverse circumstances. This develops eventually into an all-embracing love, where one sees all beings in oneself and oneself in all beings. The sense of otherness goes. Fear comes from that sense of otherness. When that sense of otherness is gone, when the oneself expands and enfolds all, then there is love and love alone. From this self-expansion, from this self-manifestation, there's real manifestation of power, real manifestation of joy, real manifestation of freedom, real manifestation of knowledge. The more we confine ourselves within the shell of the ego, within the shell of our personality, the more our power is restricted, our joy is restricted, our freedom is restricted. It is by sacrificing this ego and all that is concerned with this ego that a person attains real self-development, self-manifestation through self-denial. Religion in particular teaches this principle. Do not hold to this ego. It's false. It is apparent. It is changing. But hold to your real self and know your kinship with the Supreme Being. Sacrifice this self, this lower self, this apparent self, this disguise, this ego, to the Supreme Being. Self-surrender is the motto of all theistic religions. Surrender yourself completely to the Lord. We aren't even the masters of ourselves. Whatever knowledge, whatever power, whatever joy we have, all has one source. For the time being, we exercise some source, some power. We hold some knowledge and consider it a great thing, but it's temporary. It has a cause and has a decline. The greatest philosophers of the world, some of them end up with old age dementia. This happened to Immanuel Kant. It happened to Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. It's just temporary. We shouldn't get too excited about it. Truly speaking, there's only one master in the universe, only one source of all these things. The more we cut off our individual lives from that one source, the more restricted we are in every respect. The more we link ourselves with that source which is not far from us, which underlies all forms of existence and cannot be apart from anything, the more expanded we become. Which way are we looking? Up to the higher self or down to the sweet and bitter fruits of life? We see the outer forms of things, but not the underlying reality. That underlying reality is subtle, the perfection of existence, ever shining, conscious of its own nature. And that underlying reality is manifested within us as the conscious self. But this conscious self, we live because of this conscious self. We have the power of action. Because of it, we have the power of knowledge. Human beings experience joy and freedom and knowledge and love because of that conscious self which dwells within us. It's innermost within us, and it's innermost within the universe. That innermost reality pervading everything in the same way, but its manifestation differs. Within living creatures, we see a little manifestation of consciousness, not in rocks, not in stones, but within trees, within amoebas, within higher forms of life. There's a little manifestation of this consciousness. In human beings, a little more manifestation of consciousness. And with that little expansion of consciousness in human beings, that's responsible for all humanity's greatness. That consciousness takes the form of definite self-awareness. I know I exist. I'm a conscious being. No argument is necessary. No proof can negate that innate self-awareness. It's the first fact of existence. And it is this partial expression of the conscious, all-pervading reality in human beings that make us dominant of other living beings. Our philosophical knowledge, our ethical idealism, our spiritual illumination, scientific, technological achievements are all due to the partial expression of the infinite underlying conscious reality in our self-awareness as human beings. And this conscious expression finds greater manifestations the more we recognize it, the more we turn upward to the higher self, the more the mind turns in that direction. That is, the more we recognize and become aware of that conscious principle. So self-denial doesn't mean wanton subjugation of the body-mind complex. It doesn't mean torturing ourselves or starving ourselves. It means subordinating our thought, regulating our lives according to the dictates of the manifestation of our higher self, that self that underlies and sustains the existence of the mind and body. Now, in speaking here of the conscious principle, the Atman, basically it's the outlook of Shankara, of non-dualism. Swami Sarvagatananda used to call it loving consciousness. We're loving conscious beings. That's how he expressed the Atman. We're conscious, loving consciousness is the real person. So when the emphasis is on consciousness, we're following the path of knowledge. When the emphasis is on that all-pervading love, we're following the path of bhakti. And most people follow the path of bhakti. They're constitutionally better suited for that. And it's important to be where we are. If we think if we identify mostly as the psychophysical constitution rather than the knower of it, then we should be following the path of bhakti. And three realities: the individual, Ishvara, the all-powerful creator, preserver, and destroyer of the universe, that loving divine being, and the universe are codependent realities. When our body minds are real, we're bhaktas. When we're aware of that inner principle, then we can follow the path of knowledge. But Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda taught us syncretic yoga. We should know all of them, and we should use them at all these modalities in various ways. We should play our piano with a lot of notes. Bhakti, karma, raja, meditation, and jnana. They should all be in our arsenal. Sri Shankaracharya says, self-control means direction of the body and the faculties of the mind for self-development and self-realization. This kind of encapsulates what we've been talking about. Self-control, and here self-denial, self-control, self-restraint, that they're synonymous, means direction of the body and the faculties of the mind for self-development and self-realization. Self-development is dharma, artha, and kama. And self-realization is moksha. In either case, we're taking the basic energy that we share with all life, and we're sublimating it into human pursuits. And in the process of gaining competence in normal life, the spiritual life opens up to us. If we're grounded on Dharma, then virtue starts to manifest. We realize it's a goal in itself. We get glimpses of the higher aspect of life. We see that divine being shining there and want to approach it. Our fulfillment is not in the physical or intellectual development or even the aesthetic or moral development. Those are way stations. Our fulfillment is in spiritual development. When the spiritual reality is experienced, we know our unity with the Supreme Being. Then only is our deepest longing for complete freedom, blissfulness, and our deepest longing for perfection completely satisfied. Nothing else satisfies us. Subordinating this relative changing existence of the body and mind to the ultimate goal of God realization is self-denial. And this can be practiced in graduated steps. From the valley, we can reach the mountaintop. This graduated training is self-discipline. Now, what is the cause of failure? When we don't control the senses and the mind. When we don't control the vehicle. What is the cause of failure? It's because we identify ourselves with the mind and the senses. If we forget we're the knower and master of the body and mind, we run into trouble. Of course, we're fortunate in that we get as many chances as we need. And in this, no effort is ever lost. Nothing goes to waste. And even a little bit of this practice saves us from the great fear, that means the fear of death. So I want to tie it up with a couple of verses from the Katha Upanishad on how to kind of get an analogy, a visual image of how this thing works. Know the self, the Atman, to be the master of the chariot. The chariot is the body, the buddhi, the cognitive, the determinative aspect of mind is the driver, the charioteer, and the mind is the reins. This self means the higher self, with the capital S, the Atman. You see, each and every human being, regardless and before and after this pandemic, is a masked player. The word person in Latin means masked player. We play many roles. We start as sons and daughters, and then become parents of sons and daughters, shouldering the responsibilities of life. Students, employees, employers. We're constantly playing different roles. Masked players. That's the origin of the word person. Each time we play a role, we identify with it. I'm a man and a man only. I'm a husband. I'm a woman and a woman only. But we're distinct from all these roles. The masks that we put on in this world, these disguises under which we work in this world, delude others, and these masks keep us in delusion. We need to, if we've got a spiritual practice and every day we can forget ourselves through a conscious mode of mind rather than having to go to deep sleep to forget ourselves. It's a tremendous advantage. We get this rest from the yoke of the ego in our conscious state. It's awesome. These masks that we put on, these disguises under which we work, delude others and keep us in delusion. We need to know our distinction from all these roles and masks. So it says, know the self to be the master of this chariot. The body-mind complex is a vehicle and not a prison house. That's why the Upanishad refers to it as a chariot. The body is a chariot. Now, at this time, we might refer to it as an automobile. And I'm a little suspicious of all the effort and energy and money that's being spent to get rid of the driver. I don't think that's a good idea. Know the Atman to be the master of the chariot. The body is the chariot. The buddhi, the cognitive mind, that deciding factor in the mind, is the driver. The Atman is the master of the chariot, and the master can afford a chauffeur, and that is the buddhi, the cognitive mind. The buddhi is the charioteer, and the mind is the reins. And what do the reins hold? The reins hold the horses, and the horses are the senses. The senses are reined in by the volitional and emotional aspects of mind under the control of the cognitive mind, the buddhi, which is the aspect of the mind most closely allied with Atman. Buddhi receives the first reflection of consciousness and seems to be conscious because of that. It's closest to the Atman. It's endowed with the clearest understanding. The cognitive mind has the power of understanding and deciding, as opposed to the manas, the deliberative aspect of the mind that weighs the pros and cons. We can weigh the pros and cons, we can deliberate forever. I think there's a psychological diagnosis for that. And it's the determinant aspect that decides. It's the aha moment. It's the eureka moment. Yes, that's it. It falls into line, and it's kind of intuitive. Suddenly things fall together. Aha. It's clear. Clear determination has the ability to bring will and emotion into line to implement the decision and to guide this vehicle of the body and mind along the road of life. So cognition is primary in Vedantic epistemology, and it's closest to the Atman. And it's the way we guide ourselves in whatever way we want to go in this life. So clear determination is the chauffeur, and above the chauffeur is the Atman. So let me read Swami Nishpapananda's translation of these verses and then tie it together. Know the Atman to be the master of the chariot, the body the chariot, the buddhi the charioteer, and the mind the reins. The senses are the horses, and the sensible universe is the road traversed by the chariot of the body and mind. If the buddhi, being related to a mind that is distracted, loses its discernment, its clarity, then the senses become uncontrolled like the vicious horses of a chariot. If the buddhi, being related to a distracted mind, loses its discrimination and therefore remains impure, then the embodied soul does not attain the goal of life and enters into the round of birth and death again. But the buddhi, being related to a mind that is restrained, that possesses discrimination and therefore remains clean, then that embodied soul attains the goal from which he is not born again. A person who has discrimination as his driver, his charioteer, and holds the reins of the mind firmly, reaches the end of the road, and that is the supreme beatitude, the realization of God. Self-denial is enjoined by every religion. The practice of self-denial is necessary at every stage of human development, physical, intellectual, aesthetic, moral, and especially for our spiritual development. In order to say yes to what we are seeking, we have to say no to many things that impede or are unrelated to what we seek. Self-development or self-manifestation and self-denial go hand in hand in every aspect of life, and especially in the pursuit of our highest goal, spiritual development and God realization. So, all right, now you can all wake up. Where's Hari? Oh, there you are. Okay.
So,
there's Swati. Swati came in. There she is. Okay.
Hi, Maharaj. Namaste.
Hi, nice to hear you. I can't see you though, but nice to hear you. So, there you are. Hi. How's mom today? Okay. So that's the problem. There's Himlata. There's your mom. There's grandma. So, you know, I realize why it's so hard for me to put together these 1-hour talks. It's because when you break it down, it could be a weekend seminar. And when if I can just take a little bit less, and I find that when I give something like this in St. Louis, and Maharaj will attest to this, that the more concentrated it is, the more likely it is that people just walk out the door and they won't stay to discuss things. They'll think, well, I've had enough. I gotta process this by myself. But anyway, it's a lot to chew on. But there's a lot there. So okay, Hari, tell me what's next.
Indranil has a question.
Okay.
So Maharaj, I have a question. Pranam.
Namaste.
The imagery that you explained was very vivid and very real. My question is, what is the role of the Guru or Sri Krishna in that image of that we see in the Gita? What is the role of the Guru in that image?
I mean, are you speaking about the last analogy of the chariot and
Yes.
And the chauffeur and the master of the chauffeur? Well, that's Upanishadic, and that's non-dualistic. They're talking about the conscious principle that's animating the body-mind complex. And my understanding is that it's very necessary to understand that aspect of Vedanta, because for one thing, it destroys superstition. None of the scientific discoveries can touch that. We had a graduate student from Washington University who graduated from Washington University, which is a good school. When he was 19, he got interested in this his senior year. And he took another year in electrical engineering or something like that before he went off to his PhD program in economics. But he was attracted to it in kind of an unusual way. He just kind of wandered in here and said, "What do you guys do here?" And he didn't attend services. He'd read a book now and then, and he lived with us. He observed us, and then he checked us out in terms of the academic disciplines. And he came back to me, and Barry said, "You know, Swami, all the scientific disciplines that say anything about non-dualistic Vedanta respect it." You see? So it's very necessary as bhaktas, as people that have gurus and approach God through a personal relationship with Ishvara, with our chosen ideal, to have an understanding of the Upanishads. That was Vivekananda's gift to the West. I have a message to the West, as Vivekananda had as Buddha had a message to the East. was non-dualism. And we need that in order to set religion on a firm foundation that won't get knocked over by science. We absolutely need that. But as bhaktas, and Ramana Maharshi did not need a guru. He just sat down and said, who am I? He practiced vichara and he realized non-dual Brahman. But ordinary people need the inspiration of a living example, someone who is way far along in the spiritual path, in whose presence we feel uplifted, and in whose presence we feel, no, there's something, there is this higher dimension, and you can't doubt it when you're in proximity. We need that. So that's the guru, and he's the matchmaker. He does the matchmaking. He puts the spiritual seeker together. He matches them with their chosen ideal of God and gets them on their way with a little help and a little impetus. He opens the door to spiritual life, and then we have to walk the path. So it's not in that particular analogy, but it's in a lot of other analogies and teachings, and it's necessary for almost everyone who's treading this path to God. It's indispensable for almost all of us. There are very few Ramana Maharshis. There are even fewer Sri Ramakrishnas who start experiencing samadhi at the age of 6 or 7 without any training, and realize God in so many ways before they even get a teacher. Of course, he had a teacher. The Divine Mother would show him all these things.
Any other things, please unmute yourself and ask.
No, good.
All right, a very minor question. In which context were you referring to Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan?
Oh, yeah, okay, that was kind of an add-on. I was saying that the things that the ego gets attached to, like our knowledge or our wealth or our power, or all these upadhis, all these attributes that we latch onto and identify with, are temporary. They're gifts. We have to work to get them, but becoming a great philosopher is only possible with the conscious self animating the psychophysical complex. And it's a gift that's given, and it's a gift that's taken away. So both Immanuel Kant in the West and Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan in their old age lost all that. They had their minds, they had some kind of cognitive disorder, neurological cognitive disorder as older people, and it wasn't there. So it wasn't, but we can't own it. It's a gift for the time being, but it's not ours. It comes and goes. And we certainly shouldn't identify with it. The goal is to transcend that. Kunal. I can't hear you.
Unmute.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer a little, but I still want to verify. For many of us, for example, when we go through, say, Alzheimer's or something, is our internal spiritual, if there is some, consciousness remains unaffected by my outside? For example, not only in case of Sarvapalli Radhakrishna, etc., even monks of our order, for example, Swami Nikhilananda in his old age was not recognizing many things. Mm-hmm. And I have heard about Tantine also lost many of those. What happens to them, Maharaj? at that age, they are still very high spiritual beings.
The brain and the mind are closely associated but not identical.
Okay. Okay.
If they were identical, physical death would be the end. The mind is actually something more subtle than the brain. I mean, the mind works through the brain when we're alive, but it continues on at death unless we realize God at death.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking of a couple of examples here. The one is Swami Manishananda, who you know, Kunal, takes care of the retreat in Seattle. The wonderful monk. He has such santosha, such contentment. And as a young monk, his guru, Swami Vivedishananda, who was a disciple of Swami Brahmananda, went into a coma, and he was in the coma for quite a long time, maybe 5 years. And Swami Manishananda and another monk, Mukti Chaitanya, John Thunman, were the primary caregivers. And Swami Manishananda told me that in the evening when his duties were less and it was just he and Swami, he would read to Swami, who was in this coma. And he said that reading to him in that state where he was apparently unconscious, he said in his spiritual practice subsequent, he's never had such calmness, such peace. He never felt such upliftment than he did in what he believes to be the holy presence of his guru, who was outwardly and to all intents and purposes of medical science unconscious in a coma. And Swami, and maybe he got a clue to this because Swami Aseshananda in Portland would regularly visit Swami Vivedishananda in that state. And he was asked, why do you come up here so often when Maharaj is in a coma? And he said, I come here to be in his holy company. It's not diminished. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's and you know, and the near-death experience, you know, people that are sometimes pronounced dead and sometimes are dead for minutes or a half an hour, and then somehow come back to life and are able to tell the medical people when they come back to consciousness what happened in the operating theater when their heart was stopped and their brain waves were flat. In fact, there's one case that's been documented where a fellow had a near-death experience, and they came and apologized and said, well, I'm sorry, but we haven't been able to locate your teeth after the surgery. And he says, don't you remember so-and-so put it in that little cart, there's this little container, and he described it. He says, it's there. And it was. So the brain's not working, but the mind is still there. That's how we retain our samskaras, the residual impressions from our volitional actions, and they follow us from life to life. And they aren't burned up until the light of knowledge burns them up, you see. The subtle body, of which the main component of the mind, is in some cases more durable than the universe. Because when Mahamaya, puts the universe into the night of Brahman, into cold storage for billions of years. Any souls that aren't realized go into cold storage. And they'll come out again, and they'll keep coming out until they realize God. So the subtle body is more durable than the physical universe. Yeah, so we don't have to worry about that, Kunal.
Swamiji,
Yes.
Pranam Swamiji.
Namaste, Himata.
I love the way you said how we can be helpful to the bad apples. That really rang a chord in me. Like sometimes we feel like rejecting them and feel it's waste of time. But your story was so touching that we could make a difference.
Yeah, and I think the difference that we make is not so much what we think, but who we are. You know, that's the difference that the guru makes in our life. It's not what they think, it's who they are. I meant to mention this on Friday when I talked about Marie Etting and her association with Swami Satprakash, and also her husband's association. And as I say, they were very social people. I apologize to those of you who weren't here on Friday. They were very social people, and they would drag their friends to Vedanta, but they were selective about who they dragged here. And they were selective about who they talked to about this, because some of their friends were very conservative Christians who would be very difficult to explain it to them. But even among those people that they felt comfortable talking with, they'd say, well, look, you know, I know that you and Marie went to so many ministers when you're having this issue with your son and this congenital condition that no child had ever survived. It was so painful, it was so difficult for all of you in so many ways. What is it that's different? Why couldn't you get what you needed from one of our ministers? I mean, why do you keep going back to this Swami person? And Bill, who was very athletic, used a sports analogy. He said, well, I don't know how to explain it to you, but all I can say is Swami bats in a different league. It's a baseball analogy, you know? It's like, you know, he can hit the curve balls, he can hit the change balls, he can hit the knuckle balls, he can hit the fast balls, he can even hit the spit balls out of the park, you know? If you've got a problem that you can't deal with, that's where you go. I mean, it's not where we wanted to go, it's not where we chose to go, but it's where we had to go, and that's why we're still going there.
I'm definitely thankful for Corona, Swamiji. Getting to know you all so much more. It was so wonderful to hear your old devotees from St. Louis on Friday talk. Thank you so much.
I hate these intellectual talks. I like just telling stories. It's so much more fun.
We feel so short when we compare to them. Oh my God, they were just great pioneers.
They were, but they really didn't have a choice. It's just the way it unfolded for them, you know. Yeah. And they all got something. That was what was so inspiring. You could see it when they reached, when they had trouble with, you know, the inevitable problems of decline and death, and how they faced that, the resources they had. It was, and this is the sort of thing that you'd expect to find in monks and nuns, but to find it in devotees and to find it in Americans, I found and find extremely inspiring. It's not precept, but example that changes us. You know, the flame of one lamp lights another.
Pranam, Swamiji.
Namaste.
Namaste, Swamiji. I have a question, Swamiji.
Yeah, like you mentioned that the mind truly rests during deep sleep and during meditation only, right? How could mind technically differ during meditation and japa? What is the technical difference the mind goes through during these two processes?
Well, I think when I was speaking about that, Swati, it was we get a rest from the ego. The yoke of the ego is thrown off during deep sleep, and it's thrown off during deep meditation as well. You see, because as concentration deepens through japa, through visualization, as the mantra, which contains the seed and fulfillment of our spiritual, our psychological relationship with the divine ground. As that mantra gains life, then the associated feeling that we have for the Ishta and that relationship, it starts to manifest itself more and more. And through that, our breathing slows. Sometimes it stops entirely. And we forget ourselves in that. We forget ourselves, who we are, all our particular temporal cares and worries. And that stops with our breathing, you see. And we forget ourselves. But we're conscious. We don't have to go into deep sleep to forget ourselves. We're doing that through our spiritual practice. And that practice, through that practice, the visualization of the Ishta wakes up, and some of that divine light actually illumines the Ishta. It becomes alive. And at first it fits and starts, but then, and that light is the light of the Atman shining through that form. And that light penetrates and purifies the subconscious. You see? If the mind is a lump of gold alloy, you can polish it, you can burnish it, you can make it look really good. But if you want to purify it, you have to smelt it. That's the process of spiritual practice.
Thank you, Swami.
Yeah, that's the process. I remember a story, and here I go with a story that's related to this. Swami Satprakashananda, as a boy in Dhaka, or a young man, I don't know. I think he was always interested in spiritual things and spiritual people, even as a boy. I mean, he met Vivekananda as a boy. He wasn't more than 12 years old. He heard about this holy man who was living on a houseboat, and he went to see him. And he was a Sufi, and he was doing japa with the rosary of crystal beads. And Swami said, "What are you doing? What is it that you're doing with your beads?" He says, the exact words, I'll have to look it up and send it to Susmita, escape me. But what he said is, there are ways and means of cleaning everything. With this japa, I'm cleaning my mind. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So that process manifests itself eventually in God realization. But in the meantime, we have this wonderful gift from a practical and secular perspective that we have within our ability the ways and means to forget ourselves every day. It gives us a clean start. It's so healthy from a mental standpoint. We have to go to that state every day in deep sleep, or we go crazy. But if we can do it consciously, we gain so much more control over our lives. We gain so much more joy and power and knowledge and understanding and empathy. See, Western education trains the intellect. It polishes the mind, but it doesn't smelt it. And if we really want to progress as human beings, we have to smelt it. Eastern education is a training of the heart. That's the purview of religion. Otherwise, we're like people in those old downtown department stores that might have 7 or 10 stories. And they might become very proficient at living in that department store. But they never go beyond the first floor. And it gets boring. There are other aspects, higher dimensions of human life. We have to find the staircase, the elevator, the escalator, the fire escape, and somehow get off that boring first floor.
Thank you, Swami.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Good evening, Maharaj.
Good evening.
I have a question on
Okay.
another kind of denial of the self. Like if we deny the existence of the little self itself and identify ourselves with the Parabrahma and then carry out our actions repeatedly, we'll be able to not accumulate karma and progress spiritually.
I'm not sure I understood. Could you restate it?
Like if we stop identifying the little self, like deny the existence of the little self itself, by identifying with the Parabrahma, say that I am Parabrahma, carry out any actions, like whenever we act, won't that stop the accumulation of karma because we are denying that we are the little self?
We can't exactly do it intellectually. It needs to be done experientially. This slow transcendence of the lower self and identification with the higher self is done in stages. Swami Brahmananda says, Nishkam karma, unselfish action, starts after nirvikalpa samadhi. So they can deny the lower self and work with the consciousness of the Atman or the Supreme Brahman. But even they have trouble sometimes, you know. People would, Swami Brahmananda was the president of the Ramakrishna order, and occasionally they needed his signature on important documents, and Swami Sardananda kept taking this document to Maharaj, please, you know, very nicely, very respectfully, but very persistently, and it wasn't working. And finally, Maharaj says to Swami Sardananda, he says, you know, he says, I don't remember my name. We can't exactly work our way out of our problem. We can purify the mind by practicing karma yoga, either by giving the fruit of our action to our chosen ideal, or by having the awareness that we're not the doer, which is much more difficult. But we can't work our way out exactly by karma, because all karma is mixed. it's good, bad, and mixed. It's kind of a, Ramakrishna says you can't walk through a sooty room without getting a muddy room without getting a little mud on you. So at some point, when our desperation for liberation, when our yearning becomes intense, then grace comes. And that grace is what liberates us. So karma yoga is important, but we also need to practice our spiritual disciplines regularly.
Thank you, Maharaj.
And when we do both slowly, there's less accumulation of karma as we work. And Vivekananda, again, these great ones. He said, my whole life, towards the end of his life, I've never done anything for myself. Can you imagine? So if you have that attitude, I guess that's real karma yoga. You're not making any karma.
Thank you, Maharaj.
No, you're welcome.